Just a few miles away from what is today downtown Los Angeles, one of the most critical battles of the Mexican-American War took place. Here now, History at the OK Corral brings you the brutal true story of the Battle of Rio San Gabriel. Los Angeles, California, January 8, 1848. As bullets slam into the water all around them, a force of just over 500 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines are caught in the middle of the San Gabriel River. Their mission is to attack a fort manned by Mexican soldiers which lies just to the north of this river. But, much to their growing terror, the river has proven more difficult to cross than they had anticipated, with their heavy cannons and armaments making the task even more arduous. As they pour fire into the attacking Americans from their positions behind the fort walls, the desperation amongst the Mexican troops is also palpable. They know that they are not only dwarfed in number by the oncoming American forces, but they are also running low on ammunition, a problem which now plagues the Mexican army in these late stages of the Mexican-American War. Now, their only hope is to make the most of what meager ammunition they do have, or they will be overrun and their homeland of Alta California will likely be lost. Every man on either side of this battle knows the stakes at hand, and thus a vicious fight now unfolds. As bullets whiz by them and the cries of wounded men and animals fill the air, many of the Americans crossing the rather innocuous-looking river suddenly find themselves quite literally bogged down in a pocket of quicksand. This makes them easy targets for their Mexican adversaries, and gunfire from the fortress quickly begins to concentrate on the unfortunate Americans now momentarily stuck midway across the river. Unfortunately for the Mexican troops, the poor quality of their gunpowder and dwindling ammunition supplies makes precision firing all but impossible. However, despite the relatively inaccurate fire, they attempt to make up for this deficiency with volume and intensity of fire in a last-ditch effort to thwart the attack. In a matter of only a few seconds, the American advance seemingly devolves into unadulterated chaos. However, for these American forces fighting roughly 3,000 miles away from their nation's capital, chaos has unfortunately been the order of the day in the preceding week leading up to this battle. As the fog of war engulfs them, many are unsure exactly who is in charge. Commodore Robert F. Stockton has argued vociferously for weeks with General Stephen Watts Kearny over which of the two men is truly in command of American forces here in Mexican-held Alta California. General Kearny has, in fact, already accomplished the longest, most arduous cross-country trek in U.S. Army history by leading his, quote, Army of the West from Washington, D.C. to San Diego, California. Here, he had joined forces with Stockton's men at the Battle of San Pascual, where they narrowly escaped total annihilation at the hands of the Mexican army. Now, the arduous trek, in combination with the hard-fought battle, has greatly depleted not only Kearny's men, but the horses that his cavalry soldiers rely so heavily upon. Now, on the outskirts of Los Angeles, he finds his forces to be far fewer in number than those commanded by Commodore Stockton. Commodore Robert F. Stockton, the 52-year-old New Jersey-born veteran naval officer, has held firm in his assertion that, since he has more men under his command, he should rightfully be in charge of the entire attacking force. Though General Kearny in fact has the military authority to override Stockton's demands, he eventually acquiesces to giving Stockton at least nominal command. Now, as the American forces struggle to dislodge their artillery pieces from the river bottom's thick mud, Stockton does indeed take the opportunity to assert his leadership, coolly directing and assisting the men in digging out the cannons and then hauling them to the opposite shore, step by arduous step, all while under continuous fire. Finally, after reaching the opposite bank, Stockton directs the men to take cover behind one of the high river banks and then to form a square around their baggage and cattle. From here, it is agreed between Stockton and Kearny that Kearny will lead an assaulting force to move forward on the Mexican position, while Stockton will direct the placement and firing of the cannons with the goal of knocking out the Mexicans' artillery. Meanwhile, seeing their efforts to stop the Americans' crossing has failed, General Jose Maria Flores orders his cavalry troops, the famed Californio Lancers, to take the field in a headlong offensive against the Americans' position. The Lancers, known for their seemingly anachronistic choice in weaponry with their 14-foot-long steel-tipped lances, have, in fact, proven lethally effective thus far, even against forces armed with vastly superior firepower. This is due largely to the Californios' prowess as horsemen. Capable of feats that would later be relegated only to trick riders, the Californios, men and women alike, are often remarked upon by contemporary observers as the finest riders in the world, bar none. It is said that a Californio is more likely to saddle their horse and ride 100 yards than they are to walk it. This combination of unequaled mobility and tactical proficiency makes them a formidable opponent, indeed, even to an American army armed with the latest in firearm technology. Kearny and his men, constituting the left side of the square formation, meet this attacking force of Lancers. The Mexican cavalrymen bear down upon them at full speed, crying, "Viva California!" Kearny orders his forces to detach from the square formation and, after a harrowing series of courageous but ultimately ineffective charges from the Californios, they are able to drive the Lancers into retreat. Back with the remainder of the American forces and their cannons, Stockton orders the artillery pieces quickly maneuvered out of cover and into position to fire. This is done quickly and enthusiastically by the American artillerymen as they sense victory to be near. Many among the American men are aware that it was 32 years ago, to the day, that General Andrew Jackson had engaged the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, an American battle cry wells up from the assembled soldiers, sailors, and Marines as Stockton orders a full-on charge upon the Mexican position. Shouts of "New Orleans! New Orleans!" now fill the air as the Americans rush across the open field towards the Mexican defenders. With their gunpowder and ammunition all but gone, Flores now orders a retreat to the nearby puebla of Los Angeles. The Mexican soldiers, lancers, and volunteers now relinquish their positions and hastily make their way to Los Angeles as the Americans swarm the newly vacated position. The entire fight has lasted approximately 90 minutes. Despite the relatively short duration and relatively low death and casualty count on both sides, the consequences of this battle will have reverberations that shape the fate of both nations in the centuries to come. In spite of Kearny and Stockton's dispute over full command of the American forces at the San Gabriel River, it will be General Kearny who issues the official report on the battle to officials back in Washington, D.C. The report, which seems to cast Commodore Stockton as less co-commander and more helpful assistant, is written 3 days after the battle. It reads as follows. Headquarters, Army of the West, Ciudad de Los Angeles, Upper California, January 12, 1847. Sir, I have the honor to report that at the request of Commodore R.F. Stockton, who in September last assumed the title of Governor of California, I consented to take command of an expedition to this place, capital of the country, and that, on the 29th of December, I left San Diego with about 500 men, consisting of 60 dismounted dragoons under Captain Turner, 50 California volunteers, and the remainder of Marines and sailors with a battery of artillery. Lieutenant Emery, topographical engineers, acted as Assistant Adjutant General. Commodore Stockton accompanied us. We proceeded on our route without seeing the enemy until the 8th instant, when they showed themselves in full force of 600 mounted men with 4 pieces of artillery under their Governor Flores, occupying the heights in front of us which commanded the crossing of the River San Gabriel, and they ready to oppose our further progress. The necessary disposition of our troops was immediately made by covering our front with a strong party of skirmishers, placing our wagons and baggage train in the rear of them, and protecting the flanks and rear with the remainder of the command. We then proceeded, forded the river, carried the heights, and drove the enemy from them after an action of about 1.5 hours, during which they made a charge upon our left flank, which was repulsed. Soon after which they retreated and left us in possession of the field on which we encamped that night. Our loss in the actions was small, being 1 private killed and 2 officers, Lieutenant Renshaw of the Navy and Captain Gillespie of the Volunteers, and 11 privates wounded. The enemy, mounted on fine horses and being the best riders in the world, carried off their killed and wounded, and we know not the number of them, though it must have been considerable. After seizing control of the Mexican position, Kearny, Stockton, and the American forces now make camp atop the mesa overlooking Los Angeles. All among them know that the victory they have won on this day is indeed a decisive one, and that seizing control of the whole of the California territory is now as close as overtaking the small Puebla only a few miles away. Meanwhile, the soldiers and citizens now effectively trapped within the confines of Los Angeles pensively take stock of their circumstances. They are virtually devoid of usable ammunition and quality gunpowder, and have been forced to forfeit virtually all of their territories in the span of only a few months. Many among them have in fact long argued for annexation by the United States, having grown weary of dismissive treatment of themselves and their lands by the Mexican government, who by and large considers their northern territories to be both of little value and little import. The year prior, their own governor, Pio Pico, had already fled south, ostensibly to argue for more support in front of the Mexican Congress. But his faith in his own government's willingness and ability to support him had waned so significantly that he had, in fact, argued for the annexation of California as a British protectorate just prior to the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. Amongst the citizens of Los Angeles, the city Pico himself had designated as California's capital, his conspicuous absence is increasingly attributed to his fear of being captured by the advancing Americans. Now, save for a few governing officials and military officers, the Californios have essentially been left to fend for themselves against the oncoming Americans. Many of them are simply tired of their young men fighting and dying for a government who seems unable and unwilling to outfit them with proper weapons and officers. However, there are many who insist that the American incursion must be halted at all costs. Ceding control of their territory, they argue, will ultimately mean ceding their very culture and way of life. Despite the growing consternation amongst the California people, the overarching sentiment amongst the vast majority of them is that they must fight on to the bitter end against the Americans. And so, the fight will carry on. Los Angeles, it is agreed, must be fought for. In the succeeding days, the Battle of La Mesa will take place, and the lives of the Californios, as well as the futures of Mexico and America, will be changed forever. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the many tales of the countless other battles fought in the brutal and bloody Mexican-American War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you liked this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to hear more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the daily History at the OK Corral newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.